Thank you. You've heard from many excellent speakers before me. And as Pat says, I've had the honor of working with the IAFF for decades. I can say that there hasn't been an organization that's been more stalwart towards the health and safety of its members as the IAFF. And it's been a true working relationship to promote improved personal protective clothing and equipment. So what I'm going to be speaking about today is the clothing part. If you've heard about PPE, it's a part of this contamination issue, which in turn is part of the cancer issue. And there are a lot of questions that come up about PPE in terms of the types of things that it's supposed to do and what it might actually be doing for you. And certainly these contaminants have been clearly connected with cancer and other serious health disorders. But it's been a real transformation, even in the time that I've been involved with the fire service over the past several decades, of getting the recognition and awareness of the fire service to taking their PPE more seriously beyond just protecting against the heat and physical hazards that you routinely face. Cleaning is really not a recent invention in this industry. It was years and years when I first got started that dirty clothing was the norm. And we now know that that clothing, as it's intended to protect you, is also a repository for the harmful contaminants which cause cancer. So does cleaning really work? Because we're in a point right now where we're advocating increased cleaning. So if I have the fire departments do more routine cleaning and more advanced cleaning, is it going to work? And there are other issues out there. And this issue of how clean is a really tough issue to address. And so I'm going to be talking about that today. You've heard about a number of others from other speakers about the specific studies that relate types of exposures, how clothing is becoming contaminated. And these studies have been very, very dramatic in showing some of those types of findings. For example, this UL study showed significant deposits of various types of carcinogenic chemicals in gloves. And gloves are probably the most contaminated item of protective clothing, and yet we do very little about that. We also have heard the benefit from Kenny Fent and his excellent research in promoting understanding of how well the clothing might be attenuating exposure. And this study itself was really pinpointing the specific need towards understanding the exposures of the neck area. And a recommendation from this study actually launched the manufacturer efforts to develop new barrier hoods that are part of an NFPA 1971 standard revision. So we see this kind of work, and we see that, yes, clothing is having an impact on providing some kind of attenuation, but it doesn't work perfectly. Again, manufacturers are responding, but we're not going quite far enough yet. So the IAFF, several years ago, undertook a study to dramatically show what type of protection clothing was offered. And you've seen these pictures already several times throughout today's presentations. But they're worth seeing again. And just to give you a little bit more flavor for exactly what went into this work, it was a study that was intended to show how well does clothing keep the smoke particulates off the skin. Now, it was already recognized that fire gases and things like benzene, they're going to go right through clothing. This clothing is not an airtight product. It's not an encapsulating suit. But we were hopeful that there would be some improvement from the wearing of clothing. And in fact, there is. But the results surprised us in some ways. So in this study, we went down to a recognized military research facility that does particulate work. And they did put the used clothing on an individual. They wore that in a particle-filled chamber. They went through various exercises to show exactly how the various interfaces might be compromised. And after that, they went under the black light. And here you see the before and after photographs. Now, we knew that hoods were going to be a problem. We knew that because, let's face it, it's just knit material with holes in it. You can hold it up to light. So obviously, particles are going to go through that. Some things were a little surprising, though. We saw that particulate was coming through the front closure. It was coming underneath through the coat to pan interface. But amazingly, it was coming up the legs, which was much overlap that existed in that part of the ensemble. And so this smoke and the particles associated with it, and more importantly, all the chemical gases that absorb into those particles. These particles are nothing more than magnets for carcinogenic chemicals. And these are now going to the skin. So clothing attenuates some of the exposure, but it's not the entire issue. So it takes us down to, okay, we're getting exposed. There's hygiene issues to deal with. But what are some of the other things that we need to understand and learn about? Well, cleaning clothing. Well, I mean, how hard is it to clean clothing? I mean, we all do our laundry, and certainly some of the stuff should be coming out. As early as in the 1990s, we did work to look at cleaning effectiveness, and we looked at some of these very specific chemicals that we know are problems for fire service continued exposure. And we saw that, depending on what process it was being used, whether it was hand washing or some kind of specific detergent for firefighter clothing, that there was varying levels of effectiveness. And this kind of caught our attention, but this is 20 years ago. And we're now coming to grips with the fact that even getting fire departments to wash their clothing more than once a year, as was required currently by the NFPA standard, needs to change. So, and here's the other thing. So all the manufacturers will tell you to wash their clothing, wash the clothing that you wear, and they provide some instructions. But if you look at the standard, what does the standard tell you? It says, well, you got to use a washing machine. It can't go over a certain acceleration. You should use a detergent that has a certain pH range. And it gives you very little guidance. There's actually more guidance in the product standard to condition clothing for wear and tear than there is in the standard that tells you how to clean the clothing. That's a problem. And as Jim Brinkley pointed out, the IAFF and many of the other associates have been aggressively pursuing increasing the levels of requirements and the information that goes along with that. And that's just what we're doing. So if we look at the fire service and we gauge, okay, how important is this topic about decontamination of clothing? We know clothing is not holding everything back, but we also recognize, and this is really important, that clothing becomes a continuing source of exposure. So even if you don't have you get cleaned up afterward, if you now put on that dirty clothing, you're just simply extending your exposure to harmful substances. So in some survey work that was done by the Fire Protection Research Foundation, they looked at, okay, is your gear being removed from service because of contamination? Interestingly enough, management says it is, and line firefighter says it wasn't. There was a disparity there. But if you look at the expectations of what the fire service says, is my clothing actually being cleaned? And you look at the clothing and say, well, it looks clean. Maybe it's a little dingy. It's some discolor from use. So is it clean? And they say, well, it looks clean. And some people say, well, it smells clean. Well, what is the smell of clean? Well, it's that pine sol smell, right? Well, no, it's not, because that's another chemical. So it's nothing. The smell of clean is nothing. So, but if you go to that same group of the fire service and you ask them, okay, are you still concerned? There is still a large degree of concern. So now you go into the other side of this equation, okay? So who's doing the cleaning? Well, you have the fire departments themselves, those that are equipped with the appropriate equipment, and then you also have independent service providers. But if you look at their capabilities, they're not able to do everything. Many of them will indicate that they can't clean asbestos from clothing, for example. So what are the themes that we're looking at here for creating change? We have good practice that's evolving, and some of those practices have scientific basis, but many of them don't. We know that the contamination that firefighters encounter is really relatively complex, and it's difficult. So there's not going to be any one special approach that's going to take care of this problem. And as others have pointed out, there's a lot of things that can be done relative to PPE and other behaviors and hygiene practices that can help in this endeavor. Now, I like to tell the fire service, and I can't repeat this enough, is that structural firefighting is more hazmat than hazmat. Now think about that. Now the hazmat, they go in slowly, they cordon off the zone, they have all this control, they have monitors and instruments and all those sorts of things going for them. And in structural firefighting, obviously those things don't happen. But yet, structural fires, in my opinion, are much more dangerous than most hazmat incidents. And therefore, a thinking needs to be generated that treating structural fires and other events where these products of combustion can be encountered are hazmat incidents. So what does that mean? Designating zones, keeping people away from contaminated areas, and the like. But there are other things. Now, it's obvious that you need to wear the PPE, and we've heard from Gavin Horn and Kenny Fent and others that, you know, you've got to keep that clothing on, you've got to keep that respirator on during overhaul and all these other events. And you have to wear the right protective clothing. You have to, you know, there are new products that are coming out that endeavor to create new claims, but the clothing doesn't work if it's not properly deployed, even if it's not perfect. Ear flaps need to be deployed, collars need to be pulled up, your hood needs to be put on properly, and so on. And you need to wear that clothing as long as the hazard exists. Now, again, this is pointed out as a practice that's coming into vogue now, you know, this contamination reduction or gross decon or whatever you want to call it. Taking care of the contamination as soon as possible after the fire. And so there's lots of different ways to do that. And the work by Illinois Fire Service Institute has been outstanding in demonstrating the benefits of this type of work. And in fact, these are types of recommendations are now going into standards. So bagging clothing. And you heard Jim say, you know, 2 sets of gear is not necessarily the answer. I mean, you have to have clean gear. And taking that dirty gear out of service until it is clean and safe to use is something that has to happen. Now, making this all occur, these are really challenging problems for the fire service in terms of resources, in terms of staffing, and other issues of just culture change. We do also need to look at all the other things. I mean, we focus on the coat and the pants because it's easier and because historically that's where our attention's been placed. But gloves, boots, helmets, SCBA, all those things need to be cleaned. I had to argue with the committee, and I failed to ask for, let's make helmet textiles easily removable from the helmet. And I was shut down. It was unbelievable. I said, this is a no-brainer. I mean, why can't you require that helmets be easily taken apart so you can clean the parts that come in contact with your skin? So there are lots of things that need to be done in this cleaning. So even though we're taking care of the garment, it's all these other parts and pieces that have to be equally addressed. So where does this take us? Well, we have a lot of knowledge. There's a lot of researchers and groups, NIOSH, Illinois Fire Service Institute, Fire Protection Research Foundation, the IAFF, other organizations are moving towards improving the awareness. And through that awareness, also asking the fire service to adopt best practices. And the science going behind that is important. It's important to get some of these things in standards. Now, we know that standards are voluntary, and you take a standard directed to a fire department, whether it be 1500 or 1710, and you may say, well, we only follow part of that. Well, even if you're following part of that, that's better than nothing. And certainly, if we can get information into standards, then that's something you can hold up in front of the city council or management and say, you know what, we're supposed to be doing this. And some good people came up with some requirements that we should probably follow. So, as it turns out, we're currently in the course of negotiating and improving changes to one of the standards that affects personal protective equipment. The standard I'm speaking about is NFPA 1851, which deals with the selection, care, and maintenance of protective ensembles for structural and proximity firefighting. We have already made changes to the standard to incorporate mandatory, what we call preliminary exposure reduction, or gross decontamination is part of that very first step in the decontamination process. We are providing details for how advanced cleaning should be conducted. We are discussing specialized needs, such as dealing with asbestos and other types of substances that are problematic and require certain special attention. But not just putting the requirements in the standard, we're looking at using the annex as a way of communicating best practices, because we know that the NFPA is going to limit us in everything we would like to tell everyone to do. So if we can at least put some of that information in some type of document that, again, an organization can look to for their specific recommendations and guidance on how to better clean clothing and take care of it, then we've made an improvement. And one of the big things we're going for is cleaning verification. So when I talk about the guidance, we're saying, okay, you know, you go out and you buy a washer extractor, and then the detergent company comes to you and says, oh, you've got all these chemicals we can sell you to clean your gear. Now they may be selling those same chemicals to the institutional launderers for the hospitals or whatever. It has nothing to do with fire service. But we have very specific guidance that we're putting in to say, okay, here's how you do washing, programmable machines have these characteristics, details that help you, the fire service, implement the changes to clean clothing properly. And as I mentioned, cleaning verification is another part of it. For years and years, we just assumed, okay, if I rub a white cloth against that clothing and I don't see any black come off of it, it's okay. Is it? Nope, it's not. It's not. There's stuff that's not coming off this clothing. But you know what the problem is? We haven't had the measuring tool to figure out how clean is clean. And we've developed that in a project for the Fire Protection Research Foundation. We have a process by a kit. It goes to a cleaning facility. They go through the washing, and they can come back with results looking at specific target contaminants using very detailed, validated test procedures that actually show how well some of these contaminants are coming out. And we've had to make some compromises here because it is a laboratory method. We want it to be repeatable and reproducible, but we've created a system by which these samples go out to these facilities and these cleaning assessments can be made. And the results we get, as I've shown you before, these results don't maybe be positioned a little bit differently, but some of these chemicals come out quite well, some of them don't. And so we've got a long ways to go. We're fighting right now to raise the temperature which clothing can be washed at. It's at 105 degrees. That's your hot tub temperature in some cases. And then I'm going to tell you, it doesn't work to get out some of these contaminants. We need to raise the temperature. People are concerned about things like, ooh, I'm not sure, maybe the hook and loop closure tape is not going to work anymore because of that. Well, guess what? Get better hook and loop closure tape and not worry about the wash temperature, which we need to get the contaminants out. So we're moving towards that. We've proposed criteria. They're conservative. We have the measuring stick, and now we can introduce these requirements to the fire service and start to see the benefits of at least effective decontamination. So there's a lot that's going on in the standards, and this is just happening now. It's happening with the support of the IAFF. But overall, it's important that there's a whole process that is considered when it comes to PPE, that you need to take care of that contamination as soon as you come out of the emergency scene. It needs to be cleaned after every exposure, and that's not popular, and not even within the resources, in many cases, within a lot of departments. We need to make sure that those methods we are telling departments to use are effective, and we certainly need to improve the capacity in the industry to do that. But I'm going to tell you, step back and just tell you, you know what we're learning? We're learning things like, you know, maybe the whole system of how we think about personal protective equipment and clothing and equipment in general needs to change dramatically. You know, I'm not talking about disposable turnout clothing, but maybe it gets there at some point. Maybe that's what it has to take. There are paradigm changes that will need to occur in the fire service in order to address this contamination problem effectively. So I want to thank you for your attention today, and certainly, and again, very, very grateful to the IAFF for their support and their endeavors in this area, and wish you all safe and happy careers. Thank you.